My name is Eden, and I'm 62 years old. The day I refused to pay for my sister's $85,000 wedding, I thought the argument was over. I was wrong. A week later, an invitation arrived that felt like a slap wrapped in paper. I didn't know it yet, but opening it would change how I saw my family forever. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe for more family drama, quiet revenge, and emotional courage stories. The envelope was thicker than most mail I get these days. Not a bill, not a flyer. My name was written by hand, neat and careful, the way my sister always wrote when she wanted something to look sincere. I stood in my kitchen holding it, the late afternoon light coming through the window, dust floating in the air. I didn't open it right away. My chest felt tight, like it does before bad news. I told myself I was being silly. It was probably just a wedding invite. Still, my hand wouldn't move. I set the envelope on the table and made myself a cup of tea. Chamomile, the kind that's supposed to calm your nerves. The kettle clicked off, and the quiet felt heavy. Since the argument about the wedding money, there hadn't been much contact. No calls, no messages, just silence. That silence had been painful, but also oddly peaceful. I didn't realize how much I needed it until that envelope showed up. When I finally opened it, the paper inside was stiff and expensive, cream-colored, gold trim. My sister's taste was always big, even when her life wasn't. The words were polite, warm, even too warm. She wrote that she hoped I was well, that family mattered, that she wanted me there on her special day. I read it twice, then a third time. Something about it felt wrong. Not angry, not loving either. It felt practiced. There was a small card tucked inside. A note, separate from the main invitation. My name again. A short message saying how much it would mean to her if I could be part of the moment. Those words stuck with me. Be part of the moment, not just attend, not just sit quietly in a chair. Be part of it. I didn't know why, but my stomach dropped. I sat down and tried to remember the last time my sister and I spoke without tension. It had been months before the wedding talk even started. We were never close in the easy way. Growing up, she was louder, sharper, the kind of person who filled a room. I was the quiet one, the one who smoothed things over. When our parents passed, that pattern only got stronger. I became the listener, the helper, the one expected to step in. The wedding money fight had been different. She didn't ask. She told me what she needed. When I said I couldn't do it, not that much, not at my age, her voice changed. Cold, accusing. She said I was selfish, that I'd saved enough, that I didn't have children. So what else was I spending money on? That was the moment something cracked. I told her no, clearly, for once. Now here was this invitation, pretending none of that had happened. I noticed the date, the time, then another detail, a small line near the bottom mentioning a brief program before dinner. Family participation requested. My heart started to pound. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew my sister. She liked control. She liked scenes where she looked generous and others looked small. I imagined standing in front of people I barely knew, feeling their eyes on me, judging, whispering. I folded the invitation and put it back in the envelope. My tea had gone cold. I poured it out and made another, more for something to do than because I wanted it. My hands were shaking slightly. I told myself I was overthinking, that weddings were emotional, that maybe this was her way of reaching out. But my body didn't believe it. My body remembered things my mind tried to excuse. That evening, my phone rang. A cousin I hadn't heard from in years. She asked if I'd gotten the invite. Her tone was light, but there was curiosity underneath. I said yes. She paused, then said she hoped everything was worked out. I asked what she meant. She laughed softly and said families were complicated. When we hung up, I felt exposed, like a story was already being told about me, and I wasn't the one telling it. Over the next few days, little things started happening. A neighbor mentioned she'd heard my sister was having a big wedding. An old friend from church asked if I was excited. Excited wasn't the word I'd use. I started sleeping poorly, waking up at 4 in the morning with the same thought circling in my head. Why now? Why invite me after weeks of silence? I took the invitation out again and studied it closely. The return address was printed, not handwritten, formal, distant. The wording avoided anything personal. No apology, no mention of the argument. It was as if my refusal never happened. That hurt more than anger would have. It felt like erasing me. One afternoon, I drove to the grocery store and sat in the parking lot longer than necessary. I watched people load their cars. A woman about my age laughed with her daughter. I wondered if she'd ever been asked to prove her love with money. I wondered if I'd done something wrong by saying no. The thought crept in quietly, the way guilt always does. At home, I called my sister. It rang until voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to ask her what she meant by be part of the moment. I wanted to ask if this invitation was real or just another way to make me look small. Instead, I sat at the table and wrote down everything I remembered from the argument, afraid I'd start doubting myself. The next day, a text came through. From my sister. Short, cheerful. She wrote that she hoped I'd come, that it wouldn't be the same without me. No mention of money, no mention of the fight. It felt like a smile stretched too wide. I replied that I needed time to think. She didn't answer. As the week went on, my unease grew. I remembered past moments, holidays where she'd bring up old favors in front of others, times she'd joked about how I was lucky to help her. I'd laughed along, not wanting to cause trouble. This invitation felt like all of that, dressed up and sealed. One evening, I took a walk around my block. The air was cool. Leaves moved along the sidewalk. I tried to imagine attending the wedding, sitting quietly, keeping my head down. But the words on that small card came back to me. Be part of the moment. I realized then that this wasn't about peace. Peace doesn't come with instructions. I went back inside and placed the invitation in a drawer. Not hidden, just set aside. I told myself I didn't have to decide yet. But deep down, I knew something important had already happened. My sister had made her move. Not with anger, not with honesty, but with something far more unsettling. An invitation that looked kind and felt anything but. I left the invitation in that drawer overnight, but it didn't stay there in my mind. It followed me into bed, into my dreams, into the quiet morning when I made coffee and stared out the window longer than usual. The house felt different now, like something had been disturbed. Not loudly, just enough to remind me that old things never really disappear. They wait. By mid-morning, my phone started buzzing again. Not from my sister, from family. One message after another, spaced just enough apart to feel coordinated. An aunt asked if I was feeling better. A cousin said she hoped I'd come around. No one asked what actually happened. They already seemed to know the story, or at least the version being shared. I sat at the small desk in my living room, phone face down, hands folded. I could almost hear my mother's voice from years ago telling me to let things go, to not make waves. I had spent most of my life doing exactly that, being the one who absorbed discomfort so others could stay comfortable. It was a role I slipped into without thinking, like an old sweater that never quite fit but felt familiar. The wedding money argument hadn't started loudly. It began with a casual call from my sister weeks earlier. She spoke fast, excited, listing things off like she always did. The venue, the flowers, the food, then the number, 85,000. She said it like it was normal, like it was something people just did. When I hesitated, even for a second, her tone shifted. Not angry yet, just sharp. She reminded me of all the times she'd been there for me, times I remembered differently. She mentioned how much our parents would have wanted this. That part hurt the most. Our parents had worked hard, lived simply. I couldn't imagine them approving of something so over the top. When I said no, clearly and calmly, she didn't yell. She went quiet. Then she said, "I didn't think you'd be like this." That sentence came back to me now, sitting alone in my living room. I realized how often she'd used words like that, not directly accusing, just suggesting I was falling short of some unspoken expectation. Growing up, she was always the one praised for being bold. I was praised for being helpful. When she needed something, it was assumed I'd step in. I had. Every time. The messages from family kept coming. One uncle called and left a voicemail saying families should stick together. Another relative hinted that stress made people act out, and maybe I should be patient with my sister. No one mentioned patience for me. No one asked how it felt to be told my worth was measured in dollars. That afternoon, I drove to my sister's old neighborhood without fully deciding to. Muscle memory took over. We'd grown up there in a modest house with peeling paint and a yard we never quite kept up with. I parked across the street and sat in my car watching a young couple unload groceries. I remembered raking leaves with my sister as a kid, arguing over who did more. Even then, she found ways to make things competitions. I thought about our parents again, how my mother would pull me aside after arguments and tell me to be understanding. "She's just like that," she'd say, as if that explained everything. I learned early that peace often meant swallowing my feelings. Over time, that habit hardened into something else. Resentment, maybe, or exhaustion. Back at home, I finally answered one of the calls. It was my aunt, my mother's sister. Her voice was gentle but firm. She said my sister was under a lot of pressure, that weddings brought out the worst in people, that money shouldn't come between family. I asked her, quietly, why it was only coming between us now. She didn't have an answer. She told me my sister felt betrayed. That word landed heavy. Betrayal, as if I had promised something and taken it back. I explained, for the first time to someone else, that I'd never agreed to pay, that I had my own limits. My aunt sighed and said she understood, but then added that sometimes love meant sacrifice. I thanked her for calling and ended the conversation before my voice could change. After that, I felt a shift inside me, a kind of clarity mixed with sadness. These old wounds weren't just about the wedding. They were about years of being expected to bend, years of being the quieter sister, the reliable one, the one who didn't ask for much and therefore could be asked for everything. The next day, I received an email from my sister, longer this time, carefully worded. She wrote about stress, about misunderstanding, about how hurt she'd been by my refusal. She said she never meant to make me feel used. That line stood out. Never meant to, as if impact didn't matter. She ended by saying she hoped I'd come to the wedding so we could move forward. I read the email slowly, twice. There was still no apology, no acknowledgement of my feelings, just an explanation of hers. It was the same pattern I'd seen my whole life. Her emotions took center stage. Mine were supporting characters at best. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I went through old photo albums I kept in a box under my bed. Pictures of us as kids. Birthday cakes. School events. There were smiles, but looking closer, I noticed how often I was standing slightly behind her. How often my arm was around her shoulder, not the other way around. It was subtle, but it was there. Later that evening, my neighbor stopped by. She'd heard through the grapevine about the wedding. Small towns have a way of doing that. She asked if I was excited. I told her I wasn't sure yet. She nodded and said family things were complicated. Then she added, it's okay to say no. Hearing that from someone who had no stake in the situation nearly brought me to tears. As days passed, the pressure didn't let up. It changed shape. Instead of direct messages, there were hints, comments on social media posts about families sticking together, shared memories tagged with captions about loyalty. I stayed quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was tired of explaining myself to people who weren't listening. One afternoon, my sister showed up at my door without calling. I froze when I saw her through the window. Part of me wanted to pretend I wasn't home. Instead, I opened the door. She looked polished, even in casual clothes. She hugged me quickly, then stepped inside like she owned the place. She talked about wedding plans, about stress, about how hard everything was. She avoided the real issue entirely. When I finally brought it up, gently, she sighed dramatically. She said she felt attacked, that everyone was judging her, that she needed support, not resistance. I told her I wasn't resisting her happiness. I was protecting my own stability. She looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. She reminded me of how I'd helped her before, times I'd forgotten about until she mentioned them, favors framed as debts. I realized then that this wasn't just about money. It was about control, about keeping the old balance where she took and I gave. When she left, the house felt emptier than before, but also lighter, like something heavy had been named out loud. I sat on the couch and let myself feel everything I'd pushed down for years. The anger, the grief, the disappointment, not just in my sister, but in myself for allowing this pattern to continue for so long. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because things were resolved, but because I had finally stopped pretending they weren't broken. The old wounds were open now. Painful, yes, but honest. The invitation was still in the drawer, unchanged, but the invitation was still in the drawer, unchanged, but I was not. The morning after my sister left my house, I woke with a strange mix of calm and alertness, not peace, something sharper, like the feeling you get when you finally admit you're being watched, and instead of fear, you feel focus. I made breakfast slowly. Toast, eggs. The ordinary motions steadied me. Yet under it all, a quiet thought kept tapping at me. She hadn't come to make things right. She had come to set something up. That thought followed me through the day. I noticed things I might have ignored before. A missed call from an unfamiliar number. A message from a distant cousin asking if I'd prepared anything special for the wedding. Prepared what? I didn't respond. I started to feel like I was standing on a stage before the lights came on, waiting for a cue I didn't know. 2 days later, a thick email arrived from the wedding planner. My sister had copied me in. The subject line was cheerful, full of exclamation points. Inside was a detailed schedule for the rehearsal dinner and the wedding day, times, names, roles. I scanned it once, then again, slower. There it was. My name, not just listed as a guest, listed under a section labeled Family Remarks. 5 minutes, immediately after the welcome toast. My chest tightened. I hadn't been asked. No one had mentioned this to me. It was written as if I'd already agreed, as if it were settled. I closed the laptop and stared at the wall. The quiet in the room felt louder than any noise. So this was it. This was the moment my body had sensed from the beginning. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, a performance. I imagined standing in front of a room full of people, most of whom had already heard a version of the story where I was the obstacle, the difficult sister, the one who refused to help. I could see it clearly now. A microphone placed gently in my hands, smiles all around, expectation thick in the air. And if I stumbled, if I said the wrong thing, the damage would be done quietly, politely, permanently. My sister knew exactly what she was doing. I called her right away. She didn't answer. I left a voicemail, keeping my voice even. I said I'd seen the schedule. I asked why my name was there. I waited. Hours passed. Then a text came through. "Oh, I thought you'd be honored. Everyone wants to hear from you." Everyone. That word again. Broad. Convenient. I asked why she hadn't discussed it with me first. She replied that she assumed I'd be fine with it. That family speaks at weddings. That it would be a nice way to show unity. Unity, another word that sounded gentle and felt sharp. I didn't answer immediately. I needed time to think, not react. Think. Over the next few days, more pieces fell into place. A call from an old family friend who casually mentioned how brave it was of me to still show up after everything. A comment that suggested sympathy, but also judgment. Someone else asked if I was nervous about speaking. I asked how they knew I was speaking. There was a pause on the line, then a laugh. "Oh, I thought you knew." I did know. Now, what hurt wasn't just the setup. It was how comfortable everyone seemed assuming I'd play along. That I'd stand there and soften the story. That I'd protect my sister's image the way I always had. The trap wasn't just about embarrassing me. It was about forcing me back into my old role. That night, I pulled the invitation out of the drawer again. I laid everything out on the table. The envelope, the note, the schedule printout, my sister's email. Side by side, the pattern was clear. Each step polite, reasonable on its own. Together, carefully designed. I thought about calling the wedding planner directly, but something stopped me. I wanted to understand the full shape of what I was being pulled into before I made any moves. So I waited. I listened. I paid attention. At a small family lunch later that week, I noticed how conversations shifted when I entered the room. How people smiled a little too quickly. How they asked how I was doing, but didn't really wait for the answer. One aunt squeezed my hand and said she was proud of me for being the bigger person. Bigger than what? Bigger than who? Someone mentioned the wedding program again, said it would be so meaningful to hear my words. I smiled politely. Inside, something hardened. Not anger, resolve. That afternoon, I received another email, this one from the planner again, asking me to send a brief outline of my remarks so they could coordinate timing. That was when the last bit of doubt fell away. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was planned, coordinated, approved. I finally responded. I wrote that I hadn't agreed to speak and would not be doing so. I kept it short, professional. Her voice was tight, controlled. She said I was putting her in a difficult position. That changes this late were stressful. That people were counting on me. I asked her who exactly was counting on me. She said the family, the guests, the moment, always the moment. I told her I wasn't comfortable speaking publicly about something that was still unresolved between us. She said that was exactly why it would be powerful. I said no. She went quiet. Then she sighed and said she wished I wouldn't make everything so complicated. There it was, the familiar line, the one that turned boundaries into flaws. After we hung up, I felt shaky but steady, like I'd stepped onto firm ground after slipping for years. Still, the pressure didn't stop. It changed tone, became softer, more persuasive. A cousin suggested I could write something neutral. An aunt said it would look strange if I didn't participate. Someone else said silence might be taken the wrong way. Taken by whom? I realized then that the trap had layers. If I spoke, I risked being framed. If I refused, I risked being labeled cold. Either way, my sister stayed centered, protected by the expectation that I would absorb the discomfort. I spent a long evening alone, sitting at my dining table with the lights low. I thought about what I owed, to whom, and why. I thought about the years I'd spent explaining myself, shrinking my needs to keep things smooth. I thought about how tired I was. The next morning, I took a walk before sunrise. The street was quiet, birds just beginning to stir. I felt older than I had in a long time, and also clearer. I didn't need to control the narrative. I needed to stop participating in one that erased me. When I got home, I sent one final message to my sister. I told her I would attend the wedding as a guest only. I would not speak. I would not be part of any planned moment. I wished her well. That was it. Her response came hours later. Short, cool. She said she was disappointed but would make adjustments. No apology, no acknowledgement, just logistics. In the days that followed, I felt a strange shift in how people treated me. Less warmth, more distance, as if my refusal had confirmed something they'd been told. I let it happen. For once, I didn't rush to correct it. The trap had revealed itself fully now, and stepping out of it didn't bring relief right away. It brought consequences, but they were quieter than I'd feared. Manageable, honest. One evening, as I folded laundry, I realized something important. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about refusing to be used as a prop in someone else's story. I didn't know what would happen next. I only knew I wouldn't walk into anything blindly again. The invitation went back into the drawer, still unopened, in a deeper way, still waiting. But now I was watching too. The morning of the wedding arrived, quietly, almost politely, like it didn't know the weight it carried. I woke before my alarm, the room still dim, the air cool against my skin. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was headed. Then it all came back at once. The invitation, the schedule, the careful pressure. I lay still, listening to my own breathing, waiting for panic to rise. It didn't. What I felt instead was steady. Heavy, yes, but steady. I got dressed slowly. Nothing dramatic. A simple navy dress I'd worn before to church events and dinners. Comfortable shoes. I pinned my hair back the way I always did when I needed to feel put together. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was trying to recognize myself. The drive to the venue took longer than expected. Traffic backed up near the highway exit, and I sat there watching cars inch forward. Couples dressed in light colors passed me, windows down, music playing. I wondered how many of them knew what it felt like to walk into a room where people had already decided who you were. When I arrived, the parking lot was nearly full. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. My reflection in the windshield looked calm. Older, a woman who had lived long enough to know that some days change you whether you want them to or not. Inside, the space was bright. Soft music played. Flowers everywhere. My sister had spared no expense. People moved in small groups, laughing, hugging. Conversations paused when I passed, then picked back up. I felt it, the awareness, not sharp enough to hurt, but constant. I took my seat quietly, near the aisle as listed, close enough to be seen. My sister spotted me from across the room. She smiled, wide and practiced, and lifted her hand in a small wave. I nodded back. Nothing more. She turned away quickly, already pulled into another conversation. As the ceremony began, I focused on the details. The sound of fabric brushing against the floor. The way light filtered through the windows. I let myself be present, not because I owed it to anyone, but because I wanted to stay grounded. This was happening. I was here, and I was still me. After the vows, there was a break before the reception. People stood, stretched, chatted. A woman I barely recognized hugged me and said she was glad I came. Her voice carried relief, like my presence alone had settled something. I thanked her and excused myself to the restroom, needing space. I looked at myself in the mirror. My face looked pale, but my eyes were clear. I reminded myself why I was here. Not to fix anything, not to smooth anything over, just to exist as I was. The reception hall buzzed with energy, tables set neatly, place cards arranged carefully. I found my seat and sat down, folding my napkin in my lap. The program began. Welcome remarks, applause, laughter. I noticed the planner moving near the front, glancing around. Her eyes passed over me, then lingered. She looked confused. My sister stood to speak. She thanked everyone. She talked about love, about family, about support. Her voice was confident, smooth. She mentioned challenges without details. She talked about how much it meant to be surrounded by people who believed in her. I listened carefully. My name wasn't mentioned. Not yet. Then something shifted. She paused and smiled out at the room. She said there were people who played important roles in her life, people who had shaped her. She said she'd planned for one of them to say a few words, but plans change, and that was okay. She laughed lightly. The room laughed with her. I felt every eye turned toward me, not sharply, slowly, curiously. My heart thudded once, then settled. I stayed seated, hands folded, calm. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I just met the moment without stepping into it. There was a murmur, a ripple of confusion. My sister's smile tightened for just a second before she continued. She spoke about resilience, about learning who stands by you. The words were careful, but the message underneath was not subtle. I felt something then that surprised me. Not anger, not fear. Clarity. When she finished, the applause was polite but uneven. The energy had shifted. People glanced between us. I stayed still. The planner approached my table quietly and whispered that there had been a misunderstanding earlier and that I wasn't expected to speak. Her cheeks were flushed. I thanked her softly. Dinner was served. Conversation resumed, but it felt different now, less certain. A few people avoided my gaze. Others watched me with something like curiosity. One woman leaned over and asked if everything was okay. I told her it was, and it was. Halfway through the meal, my sister approached my table. She smiled again, but this time it didn't reach her eyes. She asked if we could talk privately. I nodded and followed her to a quiet corner near the hallway. She spoke first. She said she hadn't meant to put me on the spot, that things had just gotten complicated. I told her I understood. She said she wished I'd been more flexible. I said I'd been clear. She sighed and said she felt exposed. I looked at her and said I felt that way too. There was a long pause. Noise from the room hummed around us. Finally, she said people were asking questions. I said that was unfortunate. She looked at me, really looked at me, like she was seeing something new and didn't like it. She said she didn't expect this from me. I told her I didn't expect to be managed. She walked away without another word. I returned to my seat. The rest of the evening passed in small moments. A man at my table apologized for assuming things. A cousin admitted she hadn't known the full story. Someone else simply squeezed my hand and said nothing. Each interaction felt like a small shift, a quiet correction. I didn't stay until the end. When the music grew louder and people moved to the dance floor, I stood and gathered my things. No announcement, no scene. I slipped out the way I'd come in. Outside, the air felt cooler, fresher. I took a deep breath and felt my shoulders drop. In the parking lot, I paused beside my car and looked back at the building. Lights glowing, laughter spilling out, life continuing. On the drive home, I replayed the day in my mind, not with regret, with understanding. I saw the moment clearly now. The trap had been sprung, but it hadn't closed around me. Not because I fought, because I didn't step forward. At home, I kicked off my shoes and sat in the quiet. My phone buzzed with messages, some supportive, some confused, some silent. I didn't respond right away. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the table, the same one where the invitation had first unsettled me. The day had changed something, not in my sister, not in the family all at once, but in me. I realized I no longer felt the need to explain, or justify, or smooth things over. I had shown up. I had stayed true, and the story others told would have to adjust to that reality. I went to bed that night tired but lighter, the kind of tired that comes from standing still instead of bending. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew this. Nothing would be the same again. The quiet of my home felt different the morning after the wedding. I woke slowly, sunlight spilling across the floor, birds calling outside. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel that familiar tightness in my chest. Not entirely. There was still some lingering unease, the echo of all the expectations and whispers, but it was tempered by a new clarity. I had survived the day. I had not performed. I had stayed true. And in that, I felt a lightness I hadn't known for decades. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the small kitchen table, watching steam curl from the mug. Outside, the neighborhood was waking, kids on bicycles, a mail truck rumbling down the street, the smell of fresh grass from the sprinklers. Life was moving as it always did. And I realized I didn't need to be part of someone else's carefully staged story to exist fully in it. That thought made me ache with relief. Later that morning, my phone started buzzing with notifications. Texts, emails, even social media messages from people who had been at the wedding. Some were curious, asking why I hadn't spoken. Others expressed admiration, quietly, in ways that felt real and unforced. A cousin sent me a message that said, "You didn't have to perform. I'm proud of you." That one simple line made my eyes sting. For years, pride from anyone in my family had always been conditional, linked to compliance, to bending to someone else's will. This was different. I took a long walk afterward, winding down streets I knew so well, the kind of streets where every corner reminded me of childhood arguments, of scraped knees, of summer evenings where my sister and I would race to see who could get the ice cream first. Memories came, not in waves of nostalgia, but in sharp little bursts that reminded me that my life had always been mine, even when I didn't fully recognize it. Each step I took felt deliberate, each breath a reclaiming of space I hadn't been allowed to occupy before. When I returned home, I found myself drawn to old photo albums again. Not the ones tucked under my bed from the wedding headscramble days, but albums I had largely ignored, those that chronicled my own life in small, quiet victories. Pictures of vacations I had taken alone, road trips with friends who never judged, quiet afternoons reading in parks, volunteering, and even small accomplishments at work. Looking at them now, they felt more vivid, more real. I realized that my life had value beyond the definitions and expectations my family tried to impose. For the first time, I let myself feel that fully. In the afternoon, a knock at the door startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone. It was my neighbor, the woman who had told me it was okay to say no. She looked hesitant, unsure whether I wanted company. I smiled and invited her in. We sat at the kitchen table, tea in hand. She asked how the wedding had gone. I told her truthfully, carefully. I had attended, but I had refused to perform the role they wanted me to play. She nodded, understanding exactly what that meant. "I'm glad you did it your way," she said. "It's harder than people think to just stay yourself in a place that wants something else from you." Her words felt like sunlight cutting through fog. I realized then that my dignity wasn't something that could be given or taken by others. It wasn't something that could be tied to appearances or expectations. It was entirely mine. That evening, I took out a notebook I hadn't touched in months. I began to write, first hesitantly, then with growing intensity. Pages filled with thoughts, feelings, and reflections on the past weeks, the past years, even decades. I wrote about moments when I had been expected to bend, to explain, to perform. I wrote about the wedding invitation, the rehearsal dinner schedule, the whispered hints and messages from relatives. I wrote about the clarity I had gained by refusing to be used as a prop. And for the first time, I wrote without censoring myself, without worrying what anyone else would think. In that writing, I found a thread that connected everything, a realization that my sister's attempts to control the narrative were only powerful because I had allowed them to be. And now I wouldn't. I didn't need to participate. I didn't need to justify. I didn't need to explain. The trap had been revealed, and I had stepped out of it. The knowledge was intoxicating. A few days later, a distant cousin reached out. She had seen photos online. She asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed. At the cafe, she leaned across the table and said, "I don't know why it took so long for anyone to realize it, but you didn't owe anyone that speech. You didn't owe anyone your compliance." I nodded. That validation felt important, but also secondary. The main validation was internal. I had walked into a situation where I could have been cornered, judged, and diminished, and I had not allowed it. I had left without bowing, without explaining, without performing someone else's version of me. When I returned home that afternoon, I found another email waiting. My sister. She had written carefully, again, about how sad she was that I hadn't spoken. I didn't reply. I reread it once, noticing the words she had chosen, the subtle attempts to guilt and manipulate. And then I closed my laptop. I didn't need to answer. I didn't need to perform. I simply allowed myself to exist outside of her constructed expectations. The sense of relief wasn't immediate. It came in layers, in quiet moments when no one was looking, when the tea was hot and the sunlight fell across the floorboards just right, in the gentle rhythm of my own life continuing uninterrupted by others' designs. I realized dignity was not about confrontation, not about revenge, not even about recognition. It was about remaining whole in a space that tried to fragment you. Weeks passed. Calls from relatives became less frequent. Those who had previously tried to involve me in their judgments or expectations shifted their focus elsewhere. And I noticed something remarkable. I no longer cared. The freedom I felt wasn't about detachment or bitterness. It was about choice. I could engage with my family on my terms. I could protect my emotional boundaries without fear. I could simply exist, and that existence was enough. One afternoon, I walked through the park near my home. The air was crisp, leaves rustled underfoot, children played on swings, couples walked dogs. The ordinary life of others unfolded around me, and I realized how long it had been since I had noticed it. I had been so absorbed in trying to navigate the expectations and narratives of others that I had forgotten to inhabit my own space. Today, I was present, truly present. I stopped by a bench and sat. The sky was soft with clouds. The sun diffused, painting the grass in muted gold. I thought about my sister, about the wedding, about the months of tension, and I realized that in refusing to comply, in refusing to perform, I had gained something far greater than any temporary approval or recognition. Myself, my life, my choices, my dignity intact. In the following days, I began reconnecting with friends who had long noticed my quiet resignation. I told them the story carefully, without exaggeration or bitterness. They listened, nodding, some shocked, some silently affirming. And when I spoke, I felt a new rhythm in my voice, steady, measured, calm. I didn't need to justify my feelings. I didn't need to defend my choices. They were mine, and they had power precisely because I claimed them. A few weeks later, my sister called again. This time, her voice was quieter. She asked if I would come over for coffee. I paused. I thought about the new boundaries I had set, about the distance I needed to maintain, about the dignity I had reclaimed. I told her yes, but with conditions. We could meet, but only to talk about shared family matters, not to negotiate performances or obligations. She agreed. That meeting was unremarkable in some ways. No explosions, no tears, no manipulations. Just conversation. But beneath it all, I felt the subtle shift in power dynamics. Not that I had to assert myself aggressively. I simply existed as an independent entity now. And that presence alone reshaped the interaction. I noticed she measured her words, spoke more carefully, respected the boundaries I had drawn. Over the next month, I began documenting my experiences more formally. Notes, reflections, timelines of the invitations, calls, and messages. Not to use against anyone, not to replay grievances, but to understand patterns, to validate my own experience. I realized that part of walking away with dignity wasn't just about one day or one event. It was about recognizing recurring dynamics and choosing differently. One evening, I stood in my kitchen, looking out the window at the neighborhood. Lights twinkled in homes across the street. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. I realized how much lighter I felt. The past years of bending, explaining, apologizing unnecessarily, they were still there, etched in memory, but I had finally drawn a line. A clear line. One that wasn't about rejection or bitterness. One that was about self-respect. I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea, sat at the table, and let the quiet settle. The house was still, warm from the afternoon sun, filtering through the blinds. I thought about the wedding, about my sister, about the family dynamics that had shaped me, and then I smiled softly to myself, not at anyone else, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement of my own endurance, my own choices, my own dignity intact. In the days that followed, I noticed a subtle change in myself. I moved differently. I spoke differently. I interacted differently. I no longer felt the need to explain every decision, to justify every choice. I had walked through fire without losing myself, and that, I realized, was rare, precious, empowering. I kept the invitation from the wedding. I placed it in a small box with other memories, not to dwell, not to nurture resentment, but as a reminder of the moment I finally refused to be diminished. Whenever I looked at it, I remembered that day not for the tension, not for the manipulation, not even for the awkward glances of family members, but for the clarity it brought. The clarity that I could exist without performing, without apology, and without compromise of my values. Even now, months later, I find myself recalling small details of that day. The way the light fell in the hall, the murmur of conversations, the subtle shift in energy when my sister realized her plan hadn't worked. Those moments no longer sting. They instruct. They remind me that dignity is not given. It is taken quietly, decisively, and repeatedly. I have learned that walking away with dignity is not about grand gestures. It's not about dramatic confrontations or revenge. It's about presence, awareness, maintaining your own boundaries even when others try to blur them, even when your heart wants to bend, even when your family expects you to bend. Because in standing firm, in choosing yourself, you reclaim a piece of life that cannot be taken away. And that day, that wedding, that long, tense, carefully orchestrated event, it changed nothing and everything at once. It didn't reshape my sister or my family. It reshaped me. I walked into that room quietly. I walked out quietly. But in between, I found myself. And that, I realized, is something no one can ever take from me. I poured the last of my tea into the sink and let the cup rest there. Outside, the sun began to dip low, painting the sky in pinks and golds. I thought about the future, about interactions to come, conversations to be had, family gatherings that might attempt manipulation. I smiled. I knew I had a choice, always a choice. And that choice would always be guided by the same principle, dignity first. Always. I closed my eyes, breathed deeply, and let the warmth of the day fill me. For the first time in a very long time, I felt truly free. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything that has unfolded, I realize that the wedding, the invitation, the arguments, and the carefully constructed expectations were never really about money or even about my sister. They were about control, about old family patterns that had stretched across decades, silently shaping my life without my full awareness. For so long, I had bent, compromised, and minimized myself in order to keep peace, to avoid conflict, and to fit into a narrative that was never truly mine. I see now that my silence, my compliance, and even my love had been quietly exploited. And yet that same pattern of survival that once limited me also prepared me for this moment, the moment I finally understood that my worth was not measured by how much I gave, how much I adjusted, or how much I performed for others' approval. That realization didn't come all at once. It arrived in layers, quietly, with each step I took through the tension, the uncomfortable encounters, and the subtle manipulations. Each interaction, each polite demand, each veiled expectation was a lesson, teaching me where the boundaries of others ended and where I could begin to reclaim my own space, my own dignity, and my own sense of self. I think about my sister, not with hatred, not with vengeance, but with a clear-eyed understanding. I see her ambition, her need for validation, her attempts to orchestrate the world around her so that it aligned perfectly with her desires. And I recognize that trying to change her, to force her to see me, to make her understand the impact of her actions, would have only trapped me back into the old patterns I've worked so hard to escape. Instead, I chose myself. I chose awareness over instinctive compliance. I chose presence over performance. That decision, quiet as it was, became the most radical act of courage I have ever taken. And it changed everything, not the external world, not the wedding, not even her perception of me, but my own internal world. For the first time in decades, I felt whole, unmanipulated, and unapologetically in charge of my life. Walking away with dignity does not mean severing connections or fostering bitterness. It means standing in the truth of who you are, honoring your boundaries, and refusing to let someone else's expectations rewrite your story. It means understanding that love, respect, and family are not obligations to be performed, but spaces to be inhabited honestly. And in claiming that, I have discovered a sense of freedom I didn't know existed. The fear, the tension, the silent judgments, they still linger in the background of memory, but they no longer dictate my choices. I have learned that peace is not about avoiding conflict. It is about holding fast to your own integrity even when the world pressures you to bend. So, as I look forward, I do so with clarity, with quiet strength, and with a profound awareness that the most important relationship I will ever cultivate is the one I have with myself. I will continue to engage with my family, with life, and with the moments that unfold. But I will do so on my own terms, with eyes open, heart intact, and dignity firmly in hand. The wedding was just a single day, but the lessons, the understanding, and the courage I gained from it will remain with me forever. I am no longer the quiet, bending sister who smoothed over every edge for everyone else. I am Eden. I am steady. I am present. And I am free.